In this video, I want to walk you through the autofocus setup that I use when I'm shooting on the Sony A7IV. As anyone who watches videos on this channel on a regular basis will know, I love doing custom setups on all of my cameras, changing all the button layouts, mapping different functions to different locations, and really just customizing my camera so that it works the best it possibly can when I'm shooting with it. And so today I want to walk you through my custom setup for the autofocus on the Sony A7IV. This is a setup I've really been dialing in over the past year or so, and I've really gotten it to the place where I'm really happy with it. The camera feels really seamless and streamlined when I'm shooting. And so today I want to walk you through all the menus, all the setups, all the custom buttons that I use on the Sony A7IV to really dial in the best autofocus setup possible. Now, quick disclaimer right off the bat, this autofocus setup is kind of geared towards the photography side of things, but I use the exact same autofocus setup when I'm filming video as well. So all the functions and settings and stuff that I use on the photography side of things will mostly apply, about 99% will apply on the video side. The only major difference on video is that I typically tap to focus a lot more when I'm filming video, and sometimes I'll be filming in full manual, but other than that, the photography and video autofocus settings are the same. All right, let's go ahead and dive into the menus and we'll talk through it. All right, so diving into the menus here on the Sony A7IV, we're gonna go down to the focusing menu and onto menu 1. And the focus mode that I typically use is the continuous autofocus mode. Now, there's a bunch of different focus modes that the A7IV has, from single shot autofocus to automatic, DMF, which is direct manual focus, and full manual focus. And so depending on your specific shooting style, you might prefer one of these. But for my workflow, when I'm mostly shooting pictures of people and moving subjects, when I'm filming video and all that, I tend to use the continuous autofocus as my major setup. And then you'll see I have one button mapped to more of a single shot autofocus as well, but we'll get there later. So typically for the focus mode, I leave things on continuous. The next two buttons are all about the relation between focus and the actual shutter release of the camera. And so if you navigate down to priority set in AFS, it has autofocus, released, or balanced emphasis. And basically what both of these settings do is they determine how the camera operates when the camera isn't focused and you click the shutter button. Does the camera still click off a photo even though it might not be focused? Does it wait for the camera to catch focus before it fires? Or is there a kind of balance between the two? You can differentiate how the camera operates in single shot autofocus versus continuous autofocus, but for me, in the types of work that I do, I always set up my cameras to prioritize autofocus, and so the camera will make sure that something is in focus before it allows you to release the shutter. Now, a disclaimer here, this doesn't mean that the subject you want to be in focus is going to be in focus. It just means the camera is going to have focused on something before it allows the shutter button to click. Again, you'll want to always double check and make sure that the actual subject you wanted in focus was in focus, but effectively what I'm doing with this setting is telling the camera, don't actually let the shutter button start firing, don't actually let the camera start clicking off shots until something is in focus. Moving down to the autofocus tracking sensitivity, and I do this on all of my cameras, I always set this to 1 closer to locked than the standard that it comes with. And so if you looked at this kind of scale, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, standard just means it's the kind of medium range between a super responsive autofocus that jumps all over the place and a very locked on autofocus that doesn't jump subjects if something moves in front of the frame or if the subject goes out of sight, etc. For me, I prefer my autofocus to be a little bit more towards a locked on focus than a super responsive jittery focus. And so for me, personally, I usually have my autofocus tracking sensitivity set to 2 versus 3, and it's worked super well for me. Continuing on, I have my autofocus illuminator turned off. That's just a little red light on the front of the camera. I don't like my camera lighting up and flashing light on people, so I turn that off. I have my aperture drive in autofocus just set to the normal standard mode. Autofocus with shutter basically means when you press the shutter button, is it going to start autofocusing? For me, this is how I like to have my camera set up. If you are more of a back button focused person and you prefer to press the autofocus on button on the back of the camera, you might want to turn this function off. But for me, I like to focus with my shutter button. I will talk to you about my back button setup in a minute, because I do kind of have a hybrid back button focus setup as well on this camera. But for me, I always leave the autofocus with shutter turned on. And then the last item on this menu is the pre-autofocus. I leave this turned off. This is something that kind of differs between photo and video. Pre-autofocus in photo mode means the camera is always hunting for focus, just like it would on video mode. So it's always hunting, always trying to have something in focus, rather than just starting to focus when you press the shutter button or you press a focus button on the back of the camera. For me, it's just a lot of extra moving parts. The camera kind of goes crazy. It loses battery life. I always leave this turned off, but if for some reason you need to have the camera starting to focus without you pressing the shutter button to start focusing, turn that on. Moving down now to menu number 2, which is the focus area menu, I always have my focus area set either between the wide focus area or the tracking spot small focus area. And if you notice here, I only have 2 different options for my focus area, and that's because on the next menu item, which is the focus area limit, I have all of these items turned off. This is something I really love that the A7 IV does, and that's allow you to turn off certain focus areas that you don't commonly use. So if you look at this menu, there are a ton of different focusing options. There's actually 14 different focus areas that you can select between on this camera, and for me, that's just way more than I ever need. Personally, I just want to use the full wide, like full sensor readout of the autofocus. The camera just kind of chooses autofocus based on what it thinks it should, or the small little spot that also allows for some tracking. Those are the only 2 different modes that I use when I'm shooting with this camera. And so I actually go through and turn off all of the other autofocus zones so that the only 2 zones I have to choose between are the full wide focus area and the tracking spot small focus area. Moving down, we have the switch vertical/horizontal autofocus area, and I have this set to switch the autofocus point only. So basically what this means is when you're shooting with this camera, you can have the camera recall and remember where you had the autofocus point set in horizontal orientation when you're shooting landscape style orientation, and a separate autofocus point when you're shooting in portrait orientation or vertical orientation. This is particularly helpful when you're shooting events and portraits and photos of people where you might want to have them framed a little bit differently if you're shooting them in a vertical orientation than a horizontal orientation. And so what I have this camera set up to do is to retain the autofocus point in each of those orientations. Now I don't have it set up to retain the autofocus area as well, because then it could easily switch between the 2 different areas that I use, and I like to always have the same autofocus area regardless of which orientation I have the camera in, but it does retain the actual spot where you had the autofocus, and so if you have the autofocus in a different location on the portrait orientation, it'll remember that when you come back to portrait orientation, which is really, really convenient. A couple quick ones, I just have my focus area color set to the default, which is white. You can switch it to red if you want to. I also have my autofocus area registration turned on. We'll talk about that in a minute. This delete registered autofocus area just allows you to clear that if you need to clear that for some reason. On the autofocus area auto clear, I have this turned off. This just basically when you focus the camera in certain modes, it then deletes the autofocus points from the actual screen itself, which I don't like when I'm shooting. Again, I'm normally shooting in continuous autofocus, and so I always like to have my autofocus points on the screen so I can monitor what the camera is actually focusing on. So I just leave that turned off. I have my area display during tracking also turned off. I have my autofocus continuous area display turned on. My phase detect area turned off. I have the circulation of focus point turned off. Basically, this just means if you moved the focus point all the way to the right of the screen and then kept going, it would go all the way around, wrap around, and start from the left-hand side again. Personally, that's just not how I like to use my camera, so I have that turned off, but you can turn that on if you want to. And then I have my autofocus frame move amount turned onto standard. This just allows more fine adjustments than if you had it set to the other option, which is large. Personally, I like to be able to manipulate and control where my focus point is with a little bit more accuracy, but if you want the focus point to move around more quickly, you can set that to large. That moves us on to the next menu, which is again pretty straightforward. I have my face and eye priority and autofocus turned on. I have the subject that I would like the camera to search for turned to human. I have the subject selection setting. You can turn off animals and birds or humans depending on what you're trying to photograph, so the camera will intelligently look specifically for that type of subject. I just leave everything turned on and it's worked really well for me. I have my right/left eye selector turned to auto. This is actually a cool function. You can tell the camera if you want it to specifically look for the left or the right eye of someone's face. And so if you always know you want the right eye to be what the camera prioritizes, you can set that up. I actually have a custom button set up to switch between left and right eye. I'll talk about that in a minute, but for the general setting, I leave that set to auto. I do have the face/eye frame display turned on, so I know when the camera is actually tracking someone's face, tracking someone's eye. Again, I just like to have more information on the screen if possible, so I know exactly what the camera is doing. These last two settings have to do with the ability of this camera to remember specific faces. And so if you're shooting an event where you have a specific subject where you want the camera to always look for that specific subject, you can register their face into the memory of the camera, and then you can tell the camera to specifically prioritize focusing on that face. This can be super helpful if you're shooting an event that has a lot of people, a lot of models or something, a bride walking down the aisle, and you specifically want the camera to search for one person's face. Personally, I leave this off, but it's a great setting if you want to use that. That leads us down to the focus assistant screen, and most of these have to do with how manual focus operates. So the auto magnifier in manual focus, I have this turned off. Basically what this does if you turn it on is it will zoom in, like digitally zoom in on the screen to a massive amount to allow you to really refine the manual focus that you have set up. Personally, I leave that off. You can manipulate the focus magnifier as well, and how long the magnification time's happening, and what the initial focus magnification is just when you're in manual focus in general. Again, I don't really manipulate any of these kind of things because I usually don't have that focus magnifier turned on, but if you want that, those are some great settings to change. I also have the autofocus in focus magnification turned on. This just allows the autofocus to still work while the focus magnifier is turned on. I do leave that on in case for some reason I were to turn on the focus magnifier. I still want the autofocus to work unless I specifically turn it off. Again, little micro settings that don't really matter, but just so you know how I have it set up. And then the final menu has to do with the actual peaking display. I leave my focus peaking turned on. This specifically applies when you're shooting manual focus, and having peaking display turned on is actually why I have my focus magnifiers turned off, because the peaking display just shows these little red lines around the areas of the photo that are actually in focus. And as you rack focus back and forward, those lines will kind of change so you can see exactly what part of your image is in focus currently. This is how I prefer to manual focus rather than using the focus magnifier. And so I have the peaking display turned on, the peaking level set to mid, and the peaking color set to red. So that's the entire autofocus menu on the A7 IV. Now I want to talk to you about some of the custom button settings that I have mapped on this camera that really help unlock the full potential of the autofocus system of this camera. So where we're going to go to find these custom buttons is down to the setup menu and down to menu number 3, which is operation customize, and then over to the photo custom key / dial set. And this is where I do all of my custom button mapping. Now, like I mentioned already and showed you in the focus menu, I do have my shutter button set up so that when I press it, it does start autofocus, so just be aware of that. But then the other custom buttons that I have set up on this camera, a lot of the custom buttons that I have set up specifically relate to the autofocus. So the first button I want to talk about is the little AEL button on the far right side of the camera, just kind of next to where your thumb would sit. And this is the button that I have customized to switch between the left and the right eye when the camera is doing face and eye tracking. I don't use this button a lot, but it's really helpful just to have it there on the camera so that when you are focusing on a specific subject's eyes, if you want the camera to prioritize a different eye, you can just tap that button and the camera will switch from whichever eye it was focusing on to the other eye. This is not really something I use a lot, but again, it's really useful to have set up this way. Moving on now to button 2, and this is the autofocus on button on the back of the A7 IV. Now this setup is something I do on all of my cameras, and it's basically like a hybrid back button focus on the camera. Now, like I mentioned before, I do have my shutter button set up, so when I half press the shutter button, it starts the autofocus. And the autofocus that I have enabled on this camera is the continuous autofocus. So as long as I'm half pressing the shutter button, the camera's constantly focusing. But there are times where I want to focus, stop, and then recompose, move the camera, do something very similar to what a more traditional back button focus would be. And so I have my autofocus on button on the back of the camera mapped to be a focus hold button. Effectively, what I can do is begin focusing by half pressing the shutter button. Once the focus catches on whatever subject I want it to focus on, if I want to stop that focus, then I hold down the autofocus on button, and that locks the focus at whatever distance it was set at. As long as I hold that button, I can move the camera around, I can recompose, I can do anything I want. That focus will hold, and then I can press the shutter, take an image, just like you could with the back button focus setup. This is really helpful if you're trying to massively recompose and the tracking's not working correctly, or if the focus is going a little bit crazy. Being able to lock the focus and just hold the focus at a specific spot is really, really helpful. And so that's how I have this camera set up. The third button I want to talk about is the little C1 button on the back of the camera. This is the custom button number 1. And I have this button set up to recall the registered autofocus area and begin autofocus. One of the things you can do on this camera is if you want to register a specific autofocus point anywhere across the entire sensor, you can move the autofocus point to that location and then hold the function button, and that will register that specific autofocus point or area. So for me, I use that small spot with tracking. And so what I've actually done is I've put that small spot with tracking in the center of my camera, held down the function button, and mapped the small spot with tracking to the center of the camera. Because that's now a registered autofocus setting on the camera, then when I press the C1 button, no matter what other mode I'm on, the camera will automatically recall that specific point and begin tracking. This is really helpful, for instance, if I'm on the wide autofocus area and then all of a sudden something happens where I want to very quickly focus and start tracking on a specific subject. Rather than trying to have to change all the autofocus areas and everything like that, I can just simply press the C1 button. That autofocus point will immediately recall and begin autofocus with full tracking as long as I hold that C1 button. This is basically a way to start tracking from the center of the frame immediately with just the press of a button. Now, the other button that I do want to talk about on the camera is actually on the top of the camera, and that is button number 2, or the C2 button, which is right next to the movie record button, kind of behind the shutter button. And what I have this button mapped to do is to switch the focus area. Now, if you remember back when we were walking through the autofocus menu, I talked about how I limit my autofocus areas to the full wide autofocus area, the full sensor coverage, or the simple small spot with tracking. And having the C2 button mapped to switch the focus area allows me to effectively cycle between these two different modes with just the tap of a button. This is particularly useful because on the A7IV, you actually can't split the autofocus area that's remembered between the photo mode and the video mode. So if you were on a spot tracking mode on photo and you switch the camera to video, you're still going to be on a spot tracking mode. And typically for video, I like to use the full wide area. Now, because I have the C2 button mapped to switch my focus areas and I have my focus areas limited to only 2 specific areas, I can simply tap the C2 button and it'll switch the focus mode from the small tracking to the wide area or vice versa. So obviously that's a lot of buttons specifically set up to deal with focus operation, but what I'm trying to do with this camera is set it up so that regardless of whether I'm shooting photo or video, whether I'm in a wide autofocus area and quickly need to start tracking, whether I'm tracking somebody and need to stop tracking so I can just do more of a back button focus setup, either way, I have all of that available to me without ever having to take the camera down from my face. Everything is mapped to a specific button on the back that I can easily manipulate. So that is my custom autofocus setup for the Sony A7IV. If you have any questions about this, would like to have a conversation about why I made specific choices, or you have a different setup that you would like to share, please leave all of those thoughts down in the comments and I will see you in the next video. Cheers.